everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be a pattern review and sew along for the Vogue pattern 2902. This is a vintage reproduction pattern that I've had in my stash for absolutely ages, and I finally found the time and the right fabric to turn it into an actual dress. And of course I wanted to share the process and my thoughts on the pattern with all of you, which is the purpose of this video. So hopefully this will be helpful to any of you who are interested in purchasing or following this pattern. Because they do show it in both black and white on the envelope, I personally felt like I had to make it in both black and white. So I bought the same fabrics in two different colors, and these are the finished dresses. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the very beginning when I opened up the envelope and was in shock over how little tissue there was inside of it. Seriously, this is not intimidating at a glance. There's such a small amount of tissue. As you must do, I ruined the factory folds, all in pursuit of making a mock-up to see how this pattern fit me before I got onto making the final dress. And this is what my mock-up looked like in all of its glory. Isn't it beautiful? I made this very, very quickly and very sloppily, purely to check the fit, and surprisingly the fit was pretty awesome. I made the size 16 and I feel like it is really pretty true to size. The only alteration I ended up making was just taking the darts in, so instead of sewing right across where the dart is marked, I sewed a 1/4 inch beyond that point. So I did take the bodice in by about 1 inch total in both the bust and the waist. But the fit in the straps and the bust and the length and everything else was pretty much perfect, so I could carry on cutting it out of my final fabric, which is this beautiful quilting cotton by Allison Glass. I'm going to be using a moth print for the majority of these dresses, and then I have these coordinating rainbow prints that will be used for the trim at both the top and the bottom. And in case it wasn't clear from the finished photos, I'm making view B, which has the band around the bust and around the hemline. My pattern was pinned to the fabric, and then I carefully cut out all of the pieces, following the lines of the tissue exactly, since I'm not making any alterations to this. And since I was making 2 of these dresses, there was quite a bit of cutting to do, though I did manage to cut through most of the layers of material at once, which saved me some time. After all of my pieces were cut to size, I went through and clipped all of the notches, which are important for getting things to line up later on. With all of the notches clipped, it was time to mark the darts, and there are quite a few darts. There are 2 darts on the back panel and there are 4 darts on the front panel. And unfortunately, these are not triangular darts where you can just mark the top and the bottom and connect lines with a ruler. These are curved, so you have to mark quite a few different points. And to do that, I just weighted down my pattern, and then I folded it up so I could mark underneath it onto the fabric. And I repeated this for all of the darts, for all of the panels. And after I had all of the markings on it, I could go ahead and connect the lines using a ruler. And I'm just using a water-soluble marking pen for this. It was much easier to make these markings on the white fabric than the black, as you might imagine. And I also had to make all of these markings on my lining, which I cut from muslin. Now this dress is intended to be fully lined, so you're supposed to fully line the skirt as well, which I opted not to do for reasons I will get into in a little bit, but I did want to fully line the bodice. So I cut the bodice pieces out once again from a muslin, and then I transferred the markings and dart placement onto those pieces as well. Now the first 3 steps of the instructions are stitching the darts into the bodice front and the bodice back. And for the lining pieces, they want you to do some additional steps before you sew the darts, but I'm lazy and I like streamlining the process and pinning everything and sewing everything and pressing everything. So I decided to pin all the darts at once, sew all the darts at once, and press all the darts at once, and then refer back to their instructions after I had accomplished that. So here I am pinning the darts. I did this just by folding the fabric at the center point of the dart and then making sure my pins went through the markings on both sides of the material, ensuring that the dart was perfectly matched up. And when I sewed the underbust darts, I stitched a 1/4 inch away from the marking. So each dart is a 1/2 inch smaller than it was originally intended to be. I did leave the side darts in the front alone, as well as the back darts. And then it was over to the sewing machine where I sewed all of those, and I either sewed exactly across the marking of the dart or a 1/4 inch beyond it, depending on where the dart was positioned. And that is basically everything I did on day 1, and I did not film a voiceover for any of it because I was not in a chatty mood. But when it came to constructing this dress, I did a good job of talking through the process, so I can cut to that footage now. So I started on these dresses yesterday, but I was not in a particularly chatty mood, and I decided I would move forward with assembling the bodice for the black dress and do some troubleshooting and sort of figure out how it went together before I tried to talk through the process. So the black bodice is far from finished, but I've tackled a lot of the steps that originally concerned me, so I feel like I'm better prepared to assemble the white one with all of you. So I just finished sewing all of the darts, and for the back panel, the darts were pressed towards the center back. I did not do a good job with that one apparently. And I sewed the darts for both the lining and the outer layer of the bodice. The next step is just clipping the darts. So it says stitch remaining dart in front, trim to 5/8 of an inch, press open. So that is going to be the next step. And then here you can just see them pressing the bodice back darts towards the center. And like I'm sure I said in the voiceover, I want to take this bodice in. So this is my marking for the dart, which is what is marked on the tissue or the pattern, and this is where I actually sewed. So I just lined my presser foot up with that marking and stitched a 1/4 inch away from it. So now we will trim the seam allowance for the darts down. I'm also going to clip upward about a 1/4 inch away from the point of the dart because I find that makes it flatten out a bit better. And I think they actually have you sewing the darts into the lining a little bit later after you do some additional finishing, but I'm disregarding that. And I am clipping more of the seam allowance out of the darts in the lining. This way the seam allowance will overlap instead of ending at the same point, and there shouldn't be as much bulk at that point. So from the inside, I'm pressing those open, and then I'm pressing the side darts down, and then we'll lay the top of the dart. So the top of the dart is sort of level with the top of the seam roll, so I can press it to have a curved top. And that is one neatly pressed dart. So with the darts pressed, the next step I'm going to do is just seaming together one side seam, the right side seam, and then sewing together the top 3 inches of the left side seam. I'm sure I edited out, but there was about 3 minutes of dead air there while I tried to find a pencil in the mess that is my sewing room. So with that marked, I'm just going to pin above that point. And then the other side will be seamed from top to bottom. We'll just repeat this with the outer fabric layer. They do have a notch already marking the point you're supposed to seam above, but I'm going to give myself as much room as possible because I have pretty broad shoulders, so side zippers are sort of my enemy. So if I can squeak out an extra 1/2 inch to get that zipper over my head, I'm going to do it. And when you sew these seams, it's important that you make sure the dart is laying in the correct orientation. And now those are ready to be sewn, but since I'm lazy, I'm going to be sewing the collar at the same time. So let's bring those pieces over and show you what needs to be done. Actually, I guess first we should just address the instructions. So it says stitch bust darts and bodice front. We did that. Stitch darts and bodice back. We did that. For the lining, it wants you to reinforce the point where it is going to be turned inward for the zipper, which we did not do, but that's fine. And then it just wants you to repeat the process sewing the darts, trimming the excess and pressing them. And then it wants you to turn in the portion that is left open. And then it wants you to turn in the bottom edge of the lining. So we'll be doing all of that in a moment. But for now, we're going to focus on the facings, and it says for facings, turn in seam allowances on shoulder strap and sides of one front band section. So this is the lining layer. And then it wants you to pin front band facing sections together, stitch pivoting at inner corners, symbols, leaving sides and shoulder strap ends open, clip to inner corners, trim. And then you repeat this process on the back band. When you sew up the shoulder seams and the side seams, you're supposed to fold that pressed edge out of the way so it isn't sewn as part of the seam. And this means that your seam allowances are less bulky, and it also means you have a finished edge you can tuck the seam allowance under, and then you can just stitch the folded edges of the lining together to neatly finish it. I don't feel like this is fully necessary on the side seams because those are going to be pressed up against the bodice fabric, so they don't really need to be finished. But this is a nice, relatively seamless way of doing it for the shoulder straps. So these are our facing pieces that we have to prep. I'm using a different fabric for lining, so that makes it really easy to figure out which piece needs to be pressed. And I'm going to be pressing these edges inward by eye, but you could absolutely measure them if you wanted to. So for these sides, I'm actually going to be pressing these inward by 3/4 of an inch, just a little bit extra because, as I said, you don't really need this edge to be neatly finished because it is hidden by the bodice. So I'm going to press it inward by a little bit more, and then I don't have to worry as much about it getting caught when I'm sewing up the side seams. So we'll do that. And then for the straps or the shoulder seams, I'm going to be a little bit less generous when I turn these inward and just do the 5/8 of an inch. And then we are going to repeat this for the other piece so it gets the same treatment. I do find the whole way this facing is constructed a little bit fussy. I feel like there's definitely a faster way to do it, but they don't want you to do that, so I'm not going to try and figure out how to do that. So with the right sides facing each other and the notches aligned, I can just pin across all of these edges. You can see the facing is folded inward and sitting about 3/4 of an inch away from the side and shoulder strap edges. But the rest of the edges match up really nicely, and those are the edges we're going to be sewing across. And the stitching is going to end where the fabric folds inward on the lining. We're not stitching all the way past this edge, we're going to stop the stitching right here. That is what they show in the diagram. That is one pinned. I'm just going to repeat this for the back facing. Okay, now it's time to go over to the sewing machine. I'm going to get the edges of the facing stitched. I'm also going to sew up the side seam and the partial side seam of the bodice and the bodice lining. Alright, so the side seams have been sewn, and I'm going to press those open in just a minute, but I don't think I really need to film that process. You can probably envision it. But what I did want to film was just the first step of finishing the facings. So for these, we are going to clip into the relatively sharp corners where I pivoted, because we want those to turn outward and look nice and sharp and angular. So I'm clipping inward at those points, And I'm also going to make a few little clips around the arm side because that is a pretty steeply curved edge. And then I shall just repeat that for the other facing piece because it has the same sort of curves. And then these are going to be turned right side out, and because the side and shoulder strap points have been left open, you can turn this right side out. If you closed either of those up, then you would struggle a lot more with the process. I've made that mistake before. And I'm probably going to turn these right side out off camera just because it is a little bit fiddly. It's not like turning a tube, it's got all these angles to it. So you just use this process of kind of pushing the fabric through itself and using your fingers to pull the material out until it is all turned right side out and laying relatively flat, and then we'll bring it back over to the ironing board where I will resume filming. All right, so here is one facing piece that has been turned right side out and then pressed. You can see how nice and sharp it looks. And this is one that has not been pressed, and this, my friends, is why ironing matters. So for this, they recommend cutting the facing out of the same material as the lining, and that's because you can sort of see the edge of the lining underneath the facing when it isn't perfectly pressed. I didn't have enough of this fabric to confidently cut it out of the lining as well, so I am using a coordinating material on the interior so it also won't be super obvious. When you're pressing this, the edges sort of have a habit of bagging over each other like you can see here. So if I were to press that in place, it wouldn't actually have the dimensions it's supposed to, as when this edge has tension on it and it's turned inward really crisply at the seam point, it has different dimensions than when it bags over like that. So to try and get these edges nice and crisp and sharp, I'm using a knitting needle, and I'm just sort of pushing the point of the needle along the seam point between the fabrics, and then I am pressing, and that makes it look nice and crisp. And you can't really do this for the inner portion like over here because the knitting needle doesn't reach nicely, but you can do it for the edges and the straps. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just dragging the knitting needle sort of across the seam point and then pressing. And this is a great trick to do with collars as well, or pockets, or anything that you want to be precisely pressed after it has been turned right side out. And typically a good way to do this is by pressing the seam allowance open before turning it right side out. That's what I do on collars, but you can't really do that on something as oddly shaped as this. Okay, so I pressed as many edges as I can with the help of the needle. So now I'm just going to sort of massage the seam point to make sure that the fabric is sitting how I want it. And then I'll press across it. So now it is time to seam the facings together, and if you've done everything right, then the folded edge of the lining should sit just past the seam allowance, so you can sew up these seams with the seam allowance you're supposed to without catching it. So that's what I'm going to do now. Actually, no, that's not what I'm going to do now. I'm not going to sew the shoulder seams just yet because I feel like it is easier to do that later on in just a moment, and I will show you why. So I'm just going to be pinning and sewing the side seams. All right, so I just carried on with a few of the additional steps. I turned the bottom edge of the lining upward and inward by about a ½ inch, and then I aligned the top edge of the lining with the top edge of the outer leg of the bodice, which you can see them doing here in step 13. It says with right sides together, pin bodice lining to bodice, stitch upper neck and armhole edges, pivoting at symbols, trim. I did not transfer any of those symbols, but I did pivot at the obvious points. Then the next step is turn lining to inside, which is what we are going to do now. But first, I am just going to clip some of the points. So like at the strap where I pivoted, I'm just going to clip excess material from the corner. So that will cause it to turn outward a little bit more sharply. And I don't think any of the curves are steep enough that I have to notch them, but that wouldn't be a terrible idea either. So with that done, this can be turned right side out. And you know how I mentioned earlier that I really like pressing seams open before turning them inward if I can, or turning things right side out? Well, I have enough space on this to do that, so I'm going to. So I'm just opening the fabric up at the seam point and then pressing across it from the right side. I'm not going to be able to do this for these strap sections, but I can do this for the neckline, and this just ensures that it turns inward at that seam point and looks nice and crisp. I'm going to use my knitting needle to get the points for the strap looking a little bit crisper. Press along the seam point. Right, so the facing looks like this. I just got the side seam sewn, and then I folded the seam allowance underneath one of the sides that was folded inward. As I mentioned earlier, I did turn the lining inward by like a full inch, so it doesn't meet up perfectly at the seam point, and that's because it doesn't really have to, because this edge sits flat against the fabric, so it isn't visible. So to pin this on, I'm just going to start from the side seams. So I'm going to match up the tops and the bottoms, And I'm going to be stitching the bottom edge on by machine. They say to whip stitch it on, but I think a little bit of top stitching there looks just fine and it gives you a more secure finish. But you could absolutely slip stitch on this bottom edge if you wanted, and I will be slip stitching in the top edge. I will show you what a slip stitch looks like if you're unfamiliar. But I'm just matching up the seam first, and as you can see, the top edge of the bodice sits just underneath the top edge of the facing. So now I'm just matching up the top edges, and then the bottom edge, which is what we're sewing on first, will sort of naturally rest where it's supposed to be, and you can just secure it with pins. So I'm using a pin at the center and then pinning outward from that point, and easing the material so it sits flat against the bodice fabric. It's like, as you can see, we have a little poof here, so I'm just going to kind of ease that the best I can. So now it is sitting smoothly on that side, and now we will repeat this on this side, sort of matching up the top edges and then pinning across the bottom edge. Now, I was more concerned with getting that to sit really nice and flat than keeping the top edges perfectly level. So it does sit about a ½ inch below the bodice at some points, which probably isn't ideal, but this was the case on the black one as well, and it didn't really seem to affect the fit too much, so I think it is fine. Now I'm just going to stitch by machine using a slightly longer stitch length, so the top stitching looks a little bit nicer, and also because it's going through more layers of fabric, and stitch very close to this edge. And then from the inside, I'm going to whip stitch the bodice to the lining of the facing. And after that is done, I will do up the shoulder seams. And I didn't do the shoulder seams just yet, because I feel like it's easier to manipulate and do all of these steps before that's done. Okay, so I have the bottom edge of the facing top stitched on, which I did by machine instead of by hand. And now I'm just whip stitching the top edge of the bodice to the inside of the facing, to the lining of the facing. So I'm using whip stitches that are only going through the lining layer of the facing, so none of them are visible on the right side of the fabric. I don't mind the purposeful stitching right near the edge, but this sort of random stitching wouldn't look great. And as you can see, the top edge of my bodice doesn't line up perfectly with the top edge of the facing. It lines up much better on the front. I wasn't trying to keep them perfectly aligned. I was more trying to get the bottom edge of the facing to look smooth. So not having the edges perfectly lined up was a sacrifice I was willing to make. I don't know if that is something that I did incorrectly for them to not line up, whether it's just sloppy when cutting it out or whether it is an issue with the pattern. You will obviously end up seeing how it looks when they don't line up perfectly. I think it's going to end up looking fine, and whether you decide to follow this and follow that method or try and get them to align perfectly is up to you. But as I said, they do align much better at the front. It's just the back where it wasn't ideal. So as I said, I'm just going around and whip stitching this, and then once this is done, I will sew up the shoulder seam and get the lining stitched over top of the seam allowance. Alright, so I have sewn up the shoulder seams and pressed it to one side, and now it looks like this. Don't mind my dog groaning in the background. And as you can see, I didn't get this very close. I was too scared to press it that close to the edge because I was worried about stitching it into the seam. So I can just tuck this raw edge underneath this portion that was left open, and it looks relatively fine, but what I'm doing is taking it a step farther. I just used a scrap fabric and folded the edges inward, and I'm going to cut a like 1.5 inch long piece of this, and I'm just going to use this to bridge the gap between the two folded edges since I didn't get them right on. And then I'm going to sew the folded edges of the lining to this little strip that I'm adding, and that will cover all the raw edges and neatly finish it. So that is how it is going to look, and I'm just going to slip stitch across all of these edges. So now we will repeat this on the other side. So as I said, if I'd done a better job of this, I would be able to just tuck the seam allowance underneath the lining, and these two pieces would meet up and I'd just be able to whip stitch them together. But as we established, I was scared to press it that close to the seam allowance because then it could get caught when I was sewing the shoulder seam. So this is my little fix. And there are a couple raw edges poking out that I'm just going to fold under when I'm doing the stitching. And speaking of the stitching, that is going to be the next step. So let's do it. So it's not absolutely perfect, but that is what it looks like from the outside, and that is what it looked like from the inside. So I think that is perfectly serviceable, if you do ask me, if I do say so myself. So now I have to repeat this on the black bodice, and then we'll go about attaching the skirt. They have a lot of steps for attaching the skirt that I'm just going to ignore because this fabric isn't very prone to warping. And I actually want to do a really in-depth video on skirts and warping because I feel like I get so many questions about it. It's really hard to explain quickly and concisely. So I'm probably not even going to try in this video, and instead that'll be left for another day. All right, so with that done, we can move on to the skirt. And I'm going to be doing my skirt a little bit differently, but I'm still going to try and talk you through their recommendations. So they want you to assemble the skirt with lining, and I don't like lining circular skirts because they're really prone to warping. And if the lining and the outer layer fabric warp at different levels, then the outer layer fabric can end up bagging over top of the lining, or the lining can end up hanging out of the hem of the outer layer. So I just feel like that's a really poor method to recommend for a skirt like this, but I will still talk through the steps for lining. So for the skirt, they want you to pin the front and back sections together, stitch, leave the left side open above large circle, and then trim the skirt back seam allowance. This is where that circle is, so this is the portion they want you to leave open for zipper. I've already selected my zippers, and they're a little bit longer than that, so I'm actually going to leave it open below this notch that I've made. Then it wants you to stay stitch the upper edge of the skirt, and I'd actually recommend stay stitching the upper edge before you do up the side seams, but I'm not going to bother stay stitching at all because I'm using a very sturdy cotton, which isn't really prone to warping. The lining, they want you to turn the portion of the seam allowance above that circle inward, so it will lap over the zipper tape later on, and I'll be showing you that method with the bodice lining, which got the same sort of treatment. And then it basically just wants you to pin the layers together, matching the seam allowance, and basting the top edge together. With that done, it says pin skirt to bodice matching centers, clipping skirt where necessary, baste between small circles at left side, baste from small circles to opening edges, keeping lining free, stitch along basting, breaking stitches in small circles as shown. I'm not going to be breaking my stitches or anything like that because I don't have the skirt lined, so I don't need to leave parts of it free to lap over the zipper later on. Then it says open out bodice and skirt lining, turn 1/2 inch of back opening edges, press, turn front back opening edge along seam line, press. So we're basically just turning the fashion layer of the fabric inward where the zipper is going to be positioned to allow for a finished edge to stitch along the zipper tape. Then it wants you to insert the zipper and lap the other edge of the fabric over top of the zipper and stitch it down, and then you're just securing the lining around the zipper tape as well as around the waistline. So these are my skirt pieces that have been cut out. I'm going to remove them from the tissue, press them, and then move forward with sewing up the side seams. I stopped narrating at this point, though I can't remember why, but in this footage I'm just sewing these skirt pieces together, leaving a portion open above that notch that I created, which is where the zipper will be installed. And I press the edges of the portion that was left open outward by 1/2 inch as well. That's a lie. I actually assembled this with a 3/4 inch seam as opposed to 5/8 of an inch seam to make up for the fact that I took the bodice pieces in slightly at the dart. So that portion that was left open was folded outward by 3/4 of an inch. Then I matched up the notches at the waistline of the skirt with the notches at the waistline of the bodice, and I pinned them together with the right sides facing each other, making sure the lining was flipped out of the way during this process. We don't want it to be sewn as part of the seam. And sewing the seam was the next step. I just stitched this with a 5/8 of an inch allowance, and then I pressed the seam allowance up. At this point, I had some thoughts on the dress, so let's go through those. It's been a little while since I worked on these dresses. They're supposed to come together in a couple of days, but it's honestly been a couple of weeks since I've touched them because I was a little bit upset with how these two materials were looking together. I actually really like how the upper fabric and the moth fabric look together on the black one. I just feel like the colors match really nicely, and I think it's a good balance. But on this one, I feel like this is more of a cream, where this is more of a pure white, and I just feel like they look a little bit stark and mismatched together. So I was trying to come up with some sort of trim that could bridge the gap, make it look more cohesive, and the best candidate I found is rainbow rickrack. So I think that's what I'm going to end up using, though it does kind of ruin some of the crisp lines on this dress that make it special. However, since I am making 2 of these, we're still going to see those lines present on the black one, so hopefully it's acceptable for me to add this little addition to the white one. Now, because the rickrack is rainbow, it has a bunch of different colors in it. If I tried to stitch this on by machine, the stitching would end up being visible because I don't have thread with the same rainbow pattern. So I think I'm going to have to stitch it on all by hand, which is a bit of a pain, but hopefully won't take too long. I'm going to do that, and then the next step is going to be installing the zippers. So when I was sewing on these skirts, or sewing up the side seams of the skirts, I actually sewed them up with 3/4 inch allowances to sort of make up from the volume that I took out of the darts at the front. And then I figured it would line up at the edges, but it did not. It is skewed off by about a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch even. I did also realize that I caught the skirt fabric when I was sewing it onto the bodice, so I'm going to have to rip that out and fix it. And then I will be back to sew in the zippers, which I'm not particularly looking forward to. That might also kind of be why I was procrastinating this, because I knew the next step was zippers. And zippers are not usually kind to me. So I just got the rickrack stitched onto the neckline, and now it is time to sort out the zippers. So this is what the side opening is looking like right now, and as you can see, there is this difference here. So I'm just going to sort of fudge this and taper the amount the top of the skirt is folded inward by, so it matches the line of the bodice. And it should work out just fine. The volume's just going to be slightly uneven at that point, but the zipper is going to affect the volume at that point anyway because it's stiffer than the seam allowance on the other side, so it's not a huge deal. Weirdly enough, I did not have a vintage zipper that was anywhere close the right size for this project, so we're using a modern one because these have a nylon coil instead of a metal one, which means you can cut them to suit the size of the project. Now the instructions say to stitch the back side of the dress up against the zipper teeth. So I'm just going to pin it in like so, and then I'm going to stitch along the folded edge of the fabric right up against the zipper teeth using a zipper foot. And then we are going to lap the other side over it to create a neat looking closure. And by neat, I mean like tidy. And I'm not going to cut the zipper until after I have sewn it. There's no reason to. It just increases the risk that you might accidentally unzip it, and without the stopper, the zipper pull would come off. So that's why I like to wait until I've sewn them on to trim them. Alright, so that is all pinned in place, and I'm just going to stitch across this edge, then pivot at the bottom and stitch to the seam line. In these videos, I typically try not to chit-chat too much, but I have a dog story to share. So the other day, I hit a tennis ball into my neighbor's yard by accident, and it was sort of visible from our fence line, and I figured they would just hit it back over the fence. But my dog was very upset because that was the tennis ball we were playing with and she was chasing it. So a few days passed and the neighbors still haven't hit the ball back, and apparently she decided that was unacceptable, and she dug out underneath our gate and went into my neighbor's yard in order to retrieve the ball. And she came bounding across our lawn, completely outside the fence, with a tennis ball in her mouth, just happy as could be. So she was so pissed off that this tennis ball escaped our yard that she went and got it and dug out underneath her fence in order to do so. Yesterday was just a really fun day for her, not so fun for me. So now we are going to get bricks, and we are going to bury the bricks along where the gate is so they can't dig out underneath it again. Now one side of the zipper is secured, so I'm just going to clip my threads and then give that a good little press. And now we are going to lap this folded edge over the zipper. So I'm going to start with the waistline because I want that to match up, and I'm just going to pin the folded edge so it touches the line of stitching that secures the zipper on and completely covers the teeth. I'm going to carry on pinning outward from the waistline. Now that that is pinned, I'm going to press it again. Now I'm once again going to be sewing right along the edge of the zipper teeth. They're not currently exposed, so I'm going to have to use my sewing machine's foot and my sewing experience to really align the needle with the ridge of the zipper teeth and trust that I'm sewing across that point when I secure this edge down. Then I'm just going to backstitch at the top and the bottom. Alright, so my sewing machine is still on, so I apologize, but this is what the zipper looks like after it is sewn in. And the zipper does work. It's sort of getting stuck at the waistline because that's where the material is thicker, but it will go past it, and I think it will loosen up over time. So now I'm just going to flip this to the inside so we can clip those threads and also just cut off the extra of the zipper that we no longer need. Okay, so we have installed the zipper like they wanted us to. Now it says turn skirt lining down, slip stitch pressed edges to zipper tape, sew remainder of upper edge to waist seam. So this is for the skirt lining that we haven't done, but then it wants you to repeat the process with the bodice lining. Turn bodice lining down, slip stitch pressed edges to zipper tape and lower edge over seam. So this is what we are going to do at this point in time. Over here I have my bodices, and as you can see, the lining is free along the bottom edge. We are just going to pin it to cover the raw edge of the top of the skirt, and we are also going to pin it around the zipper teeth. And while I'm here, I'm also going to trim off some of that excess of the seam allowance that extends around the zipper, just so it doesn't flare underneath it and potentially get caught later on. Probably going to pin one of these on camera, one of these off camera, and then slip stitch one of them on camera and slip stitch the other off camera. I did not end up filming pinning the lining in place, but since all of the edges were pressed inward earlier, I just had to lap them over the seam allowance that was pressed upward and outward, and then stitch them on using slip stitches. So that's what I've done here, and I did film some of that process, and then it was also just slip stitched around the zipper tape, and I'm definitely covering the bottom and top because it does not look particularly pretty. So the next step is going to be adding the waist stay, and for a waist stay you want to use a piece of grosgrain ribbon or twill tape or something that isn't going to warp. And they actually have a pattern piece for this that you're supposed to transfer all of the markings onto, but since I made some alterations to the pattern, those markings no longer line up on mine. So what I'm just doing is pinning one end to the waistline where the zipper is, And I'm making sure there's a little bit of excess there because I'm going to have to fold the edges inward. And then I'm just going to tug gently on the twill tape, keeping it matched up with the waist seam, and then pin it at the center back. And you want there to be a little bit of tension on it, but you don't want to be pulling the fabric to a point where it's warping it. Repeat that from the center back to the side seam. And I'm going to pin it there as well, the bottom edge level with the waistline. And then we're going to do that one more time just to the center front. And what this is going to do is it's going to take strain off of the waistline and the stitches there and improve the fit and the longevity of the garment. So with that done, I'm just going to fold the ends to lap by a 1/4 inch over the zipper teeth because we're going to do a hook and bar closure that requires a little bit of an overlap. And I'm just going to fold the ends inward twice so the finished edges are tucked away. I'm going to whip stitch those ends down so that can't come undone. And I'm also just going to tack the waist stay to the points that I have pinned. I'm going to tack at the bottom to the seam allowance and then tack at the top to the lining so the stitches aren't visible. And then I'm going to add a hook and bar closure to the ends, so it will close independently from the zippered bodice. So I have the waist stay tacked in place, so now I'm just sewing the closures to the ends, and I'm using a skirt hook for this. And the twill tape I'm using is a little bit narrow for this closure, but I think it's going to end up being fine. At least it means that my closures will line up because there's like zero margin for error for positioning them at different spots on the waist stay. Okay, and then I just tie off my thread, and then we can switch to sorting out the hem. And this is where I took about a 5-month break from working on this project, and also took a break from talking about working on this project evidently. But in this footage I'm cutting out the contrasting bands for the bottom edge of the skirt, which are just bias cut strips. And you have to cut out quite a few of these because the hem is really pretty wide. I think it's about 6 yards wide in total, which is a lot. And I seamed these strips together to form one very long strip, which would go around the entire perimeter of the circular skirt. And then I pressed these strips in half on the fold line, which is just the halfway point, so the raw edges were even and the other edge was neatly creased. All that's really left is sewing on the hem band, which I cut out earlier. It's made up of several bias cut pieces, so those pieces are seamed together and then they're folded in half so the raw edges are together, and you have a nice folded edge at the bottom which will form the hem. So to stitch this on, it says turn 5/8 of an inch on lower edge of dress, baste, stitch hem band sections together, which we've done, along roll line, press lightly, baste. So I did this, I rolled it in half and then I pressed it. However, I've not basted it because it's pressed thoroughly enough that I don't think it really needs it. And then they want you to lap lower edge of dress hem band, placing basted edge along seam line, stitch close to lower edge of dress, stitch again a 1/4 inch above. And I honestly don't understand why they want you to do 2 rounds of hand basting just to stitch the layers together when you could, by machine, sew the hem band on with a 5/8 of an inch allowance and then just fold the seam allowance up and top stitch it down and get the exact same effect. I seriously can't think of any reason not to do it this way, and it's going to be so much faster, so I'm going to do it this way. Here you can see me sewing those bands on and eventually top stitching the bands with the 2 rows of stitching as they recommend. And then for the white dress, I ended up doing 1 row of top stitching and then stitching on some rainbow rickrack using yellow thread, which I thought was the least visible on it. And I couldn't be bothered to hand sew it to completely hide the stitching. And after doing this, there was surprisingly little seam allowance to trim down with pinking shears, so I didn't bother with that at all, but I definitely will if these fray when I wash them and wear them in the future. I don't think that edge is going to be prone to fraying, but I am a little confused as to why they don't finish it with the skirt lining, since the skirt is supposed to be fully lined, something I opted not to do in this case. I also want to say that looking through this footage is slightly traumatizing for me because we have a pantry moth infestation, and pantry moths are not nearly as cute and colorful and wonderful as the ones embossed on these dresses. But that doesn't make the dresses themselves any less cute. And with the hems finished, the dresses themselves are done, and I can share some finished photos as well as my final thoughts on how they turned out and how they were to construct, and my thoughts on this pattern just in general. I think they turned out really nicely, and I think I'm going to get a good amount of wear out of them. I think they're really pretty, very simple dresses, and I think the fit of them is pretty much perfect. There isn't much I would change about how they turned out, except perhaps making them a little bit shorter because I feel like the length is slightly awkward. Though I do really like the dresses I ended up with, and though the fit of them works out really, really well for me, I definitely wouldn't recommend this pattern to everybody. I don't feel like it is large bust friendly at all. I think if you are anything larger than a C cup, you are going to have problems. If you have a larger chest and you buy this pattern, be very confident in your alteration abilities because you are going to need to use them. And because of that, I'm not sure if I'd suggest anyone with a larger bust buying this pattern at all. It is such a simple design that if you have to make major changes to it, you might be better off just drafting something completely from scratch. As for how easily it went together, it didn't give me a lot of trouble, but it is a Vogue pattern. It is somewhat complicated in the techniques that it uses. You definitely have to feel comfortable doing some amount of hand sewing for this. You have to have a good understanding of the diagrams in order to figure out how they want you to turn the facings and finish the edges and finish the lining and whatnot. And though it does make me really happy seeing a commercial pattern utilize lining, which I don't feel like is seen often enough in commercial patterns, I do feel like lining the skirt is completely unnecessary and not necessarily an even good idea given that it is circular and it's going to be prone to warping. But since they do have you line the skirt, I find it really puzzling that they have you sewing the hem binding on after lining it instead of utilizing the lining to cover the raw edge that is created by sewing the hem binding on. Speaking of the hem binding, I do find the fact that it is just a bias cut strip a little bit disappointing. I'm sure you guys can imagine, but when you have something circular and you sew a rectangle onto the bottom edge of it, it doesn't necessarily sit at the nicest angles. So typically for something like this, you would want the extension of the hem to be an extension of the circular pattern. And I feel like you'd get a much nicer end result if that was the case. And it would also be a much more complicated and more unique result that would perhaps make this pattern more worth buying than it is when that feature is created just with bias cut strips. I also think it looks sort of unprofessional having different finishes at the hem and at the bodice, which is why I chose to machine top stitch my bodice as well as the hem, so that's consistent across both contrasting bands. I don't think that's the bad pattern by any means. It is just very, very simple, and I think given how simple it is, that makes me more critical about how complicated it was to put together. And that's something that I want you guys to be aware of before you buy it if you do choose to buy it. I hope this video was helpful if you were on the fence or if you were struggling to piece it together. If you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comment section down below. Leaving a like also really helps me out. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, then subscribe and stay tuned. I'm also always looking for reproduction patterns to follow, so if there's one you'd like me to take on, then let me know in the comment section below. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll talk to all of you very soon.